Gives me 30 minutes. Okay. Hey, Michelle.
You hear me okay?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we're good. Cool.
Okay. So, like I said, I think it gives me about a half hour. It's supposed to cap me at 40 minutes. I don't know if it'll stop at a half hour.
Okay.
So,
Are you recording the conversation so we can?
yeah. It's recording now. There's like a little recording thing in your thing that you should be able to see, but it's recording. So when I stop the video, it'll save the file to my desktop, and then I'll be able to upload it to YouTube and then send her the link.
Okay, cool. Sweet. So do you want to just jump into it?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. So I made it like a little just past chapter 11. But
Okay.
I feel like a lot of my questions are kind of like big picture questions with, specific passages to reference. But if you want to start, by all means.
Yeah, sure. So I had read the introduction, and I know she didn't assign it, so I won't go like too much into the details of it.
I read it too. I read it like a while ago over summer, but I remember a good amount of it.
Oh, okay then. Okay, perfect. So one of the big things that I noticed that kept coming up for me was sort of this idea of how we understand, and sort of the idea of knowledge. And I know that at the end of the introduction on page 29, it sort of speculates about what Brown might have wanted to say with this novel. And
Right.
something that kind of struck me that was kind of interesting was the fact that he didn't really have sort of any particular point of view. He was pointing, I guess not fun, but he was trying to illuminate sort of notions about religious ideology and Enlightenment ideology. But it says, I'm trying to find at the bottom of that introduction, reflection is sufficient for all purposes if the machine of reflection can be set going. And so that's sort of the idea that sort of what he wants, I guess the takeaway to be from his novel is that, for people to be thoughtful about what they're doing rather than, I guess, jumping to conclusions. So that was a big thing for me, and a lot of my notes were kind of around how different characters understand different situations differently.
That brings me right into one of my questions. In the PowerPoint that Dr. Lieberman posted, she was talking about, the Enlightenment and how this novel was written right at the height of it, and there are a lot of like Enlightenment ideals embedded within the novel. So I feel like there's two things at play going on. I feel like there's like the characters are engaging with like those rational, scientific Enlightenment ideas, but at the same time, they're being swayed by like religion and the supernatural and the paranormal. And I think the character of Wyland, the brother, I think is a great example of that, because he's described as like very similar to his father in terms of like the way he views the world and the way he views religion. And on page 22 at the top, it says their characters were similar, but the mind of the son was enriched by science and embellished with literature. So I feel like he's kind of got this duality to him, because even though he is, very religious, I feel like they also kind of describe him as like almost like a Renaissance man. Like he has a lot of knowledge about a lot of things, and he's very like educated. So that was something that was interesting to me.
I think that was really interesting too. A lot of my notes starting off, I kept sort of referencing the introduction, trying to use it as like a framework for how to understand the novel. And I was sort of trying to find a way to gel that with something. I'm trying to find the exact page in the introduction. because it sort of mentions the difference between the characters of Wyland and Plale,
Right.
and it says on page 10, no, not so 20 of the introduction, Wyland and Henry commence in an intellectual rivalry in which Theodore, which I guess is Wyland, but his first name never really comes up, and
Hmm.
Henry, which is Plale,
Right.
commence in an intellectual rivalry where Theodore becomes the defender of revealed religion, and Plyle asserts his confidence in the power of the mind to perceive truth through data received from nature through the senses.
Right.
And so I was trying to gel the two because Wyland really is sort of this religious figure, and at the same time he's sort of well read. I think it mentions that he reads Cicero and he tries to
Mhm.
contemplate Cicero at one point.
He speaks
And
like Greek and Latin.
so I was trying to sort of gel that with the idea that he's sort of this religiously minded figure, because his
Yeah.
religion sort of comes in and out of the picture. It doesn't seem like it's central, but it's definitely there in his
Right.
family
I
history.
didn't read him as like this crazy, super religious, figure. I don't think he's characterized in that way, like overtly. But I guess like according to the introduction, like Plale and Wyland are supposed to be, I guess, foils to each other.
I think that's the notion too. For me, definitely that notion, and I had done for Gabbard's class. You didn't I don't think you took his Brit Lit class last.
I started off in it and then I withdrew halfway through the semester. But I do remember like the first novel, Millennium Hall, and a little
Yeah,
bit of Camilla.
yeah, because I had done a paper that looked a little bit at Locke. It was like a paper on religion, and sort of one of the ideas at that time, around the time this novel was written, was that you understand ideas through the senses, like the notion of sensibility, like senses are how we understand the
Yeah.
world. And for me, Plyle is definitely that kind of figure. I think it kind of pops up again and again. And you said you only made it to about chapter 11, because there's a big portion after that where there's this sort of back and forth between um, Plyle and Clara about what he overheard
Right.
that night. Um, sort of the voices that he presumes are um, Carwin and Clara, and it's
Mhm.
sort of this back and forth about how Plyle is misunderstanding what he's hearing. Um, but I think,
Plyle like relies solely on his senses to understand what
yeah,
he's hearing, whether it's a disembodied voice or what he thinks is someone else. He doesn't further question the fact that it could be something, supernatural or an unexplained phenomenon. It's more of like, I heard this person and this is what happened.
yeah, which I thought was really interesting. How, especially in that later portion, how there's sort of these mixed understandings, and then that conversation with Carwin. I think when they first introduce him into their group, and they're asking him sort of his points of view, and I mean he's sort of down the middle, but I just think sort of the way that they try to understand what's happening, sort of how they misconstrue everything based on their senses or their sort of
Right.
notions of what they think is happening.
Yeah. And I think that leads into like the decision to make Clara the narrator, which I think is really interesting because I feel like, in a sense, he's kind of playing to the stereotype that, like, the women are emotional and, are overcome with hysterics. And I feel like there's a lot of moments where she's like collapsing into a fit of tears, or she like faints and then wakes up, and like in the PowerPoint, like that she was explaining how that's something very common of Gothic literature, of someone to be like overcome with emotion. And I feel like that was a gendered thing. I'm trying to find example
Those are
of
definitely
that.
parts. I think that's more, if I remember correctly from my notes, I think that's more like sentimental
Right.
literature is more, yeah,
Yeah,
like
like
it
an
with,
element of like romanticism, which is like more emotional. Like on page 46, she says, "My knees falter and I sink. Let me keep down the flood of passion that would render me precipitate or powerless." But at the same time, like I feel like she's also like pretty strong-willed, and I don't know. I feel like she's a foil to Catherine, who's very feminine and docile, and they try to kind of like not tell her things that are going on because she wouldn't be able to handle it. So I don't know. I just thought it was interesting, and I just wondered why she would
something,
narrate the story.
I think something I had read, and I keep sort of going back to the introduction because a lot of my notes were kind of oriented around it. But on page 9 of the introduction, there page 8 and 9, there's a reference to a novel that he wrote that was written the same year that Wyland was published, Alcina Dialogue, which is a dialogue sort of advocating for, I guess, female and male equality and on women's rights. And the way I sort of see it in context of like that introduction that we read about the Gothic, is that she's supposed to be this very strong-willed character. She's supposed to be someone that, despite sort of this figure, this evil, ominous figure of Carwin, she's continually trying to sort of find strength and find comfort. And the way I sort of read her was sort of an anti-establishment figure, because it, like in the like in the introduction, it's sort of discussing how at the time uh, men are sort of these very stoic kind of figures. What is it, page 7? I think I'm trying to find it here, but like the preoccupations of, yeah, no, I'm sorry, page 11, my bad. It's sort of saying how the preoccupations of men are political strife and military ideologies, and then the domain of women are sort of the feminine. And I know you didn't quite make it to the last chapter, so I won't try to spoil it too much. But there's sort of a short section where she's supposed to have another meeting with Carwin, and she's trying to build up her strength to sort of be like, I can brave this, I can talk to him, I don't have to be afraid.
Yeah.
And I think that's what she's supposed to be, because she's supposed to be this anti-establishment figure that, instead of being this sort of, like you said, like Catherine, she's like sort of this female who's sort of kind of like in herself, and who can't um who can't be the strong figure that Clara is. And I think Clara's supposed to be that strong female figure that isn't really around at the time. So I think that's how I saw her as the narrator.
Yeah, I see that for sure too. And then you were saying like in the introduction how men were expected to be stoic and concerned with politics and the military. I just highlighted, this is just a small like reiteration of that on page 28. She was saying, "We females were busy at the needle while my brother and Pleyel were bandying quotations and syllogisms." So that kind of shows the dynamic there. But I agree with you that Clara is sort of like an anti-establishment. She's sort of not the typical way females were portrayed at the time. But I also think that the further you read into the novel, like she's kind of descending into like a state of paranoia, like starts off like, her reasonably and rationally questioning like what's going on. And then it gets to the point where she can't distinguish like reality from her dreams. And she doesn't, she's waking up in places that she doesn't remember being in. And I feel like she's kind of like, and I think that is like an element of Gothic literature is that we can see her mental state kind of deteriorating with each event that happens. Like, I feel like she's becoming more and more like, you know, her maybe even her narration isn't to be trusted, or maybe she doesn't know what's happening.
That was something that was really strange for me personally. Sort of this back and forth between how she perceives herself and how she actually acts. And I
Mm-hmm.
was sort of curious how you sort of resolved that, because she comes into a lot of moments. I think there's the moment where she's trying to, what does it, get up the courage to open the closet again,
Yeah,
and she's,
that's what I was thinking of.
yeah, and she's sort of trying to build up that moment, like, you know, do I open the closet and risk something happening, or do I sort of just go for it and hope for the best? And you know, I thought it so interesting that she builds herself up, and I think it goes back to the notion that she's not a reliable narrator, because she says that, you know, I have strength, I have courage, I have resilience and resolve. And then when she meets moments where her strength is tested, or her will is tested, she doesn't really quite meet the moment in the way I think she's hoping to.
I
And
agree.
so that's what I thought was kind of interesting. I didn't really know why Brown wanted a figure like that, other than maybe to say, and this is another thing that I had read, I think somewhere to the end of the introduction, about sort of how maybe we're supposed to read the novel as a whole. Um, 22, it says, the words of Clara and the actions of Carwin suggest the strong possibility that every narrative, every experience, every human judgment is always and necessarily based on quite uncertain premises and assumptions. And I think that definitely speaks to Clara's actions as a whole, that
Mm-hmm.
there's sort of this disconnect between how she sort of perceives herself and her actions. So, you know,
Yeah.
the truth is very uncertain about how she's going to react.
Yeah, that makes me think of, like, I don't know if you've ever taken a class with Dr. Kimball, but he talks
Yeah.
about the difference between the telling of the story and the story being told. And I think that's very evident here with Clara as a narrator. Yeah, I'm on that page you said.
Yeah, that's something I sort of kept in the back of my mind. That quote a lot of the time was trying to find instances where there was a disconnect between belief and reality.
Right.
And I thought personally that Carwin, as sort of this inciting figure, was so interesting. It made me think. Did you see that new movie, Invisible Man?
No, but I've heard of it. And I think I know, like, the premise.
Yeah, because it made me think of that. Carwin, in my mind, seems like that kind of figure, that, like, this elusive, haunting figure that, you know, by his sheer absence, by his sheer lack of presence, he's sort of this omnipresent figure that
Yeah.
kind of tries to destroy Clara and her friends. And I thought it was so interesting that he sort of embodies, just in his being, that sort of gray area of not really being, of uncertainty, and that
Right.
he, as that sort of embodied figure, then creates uncertainty. You know, so it is just, so that encapsulation of that idea I thought was really interesting as a figure.
Yeah, and I almost wonder, like, if there's maybe like a socio-political commentary there, because, you know, Carwin is this foreigner, he's this outsider, and they're very uneasy about him. They're not super receptive. They can't really tell, like you said, it's this gray area. Is he a good guy or a bad guy? Like, I think that's interesting. And I'm not, you know, like, this book was written in like 1798. I wonder if there was that is, you know, explicating some like underlying tension of, like, you know, foreigners and outsiders coming in. And because I that is also, you know, like in the PowerPoint, it was saying that Gothic literature often is like, you know, symbolic for things that are going on in the world at the time, and the ghosts are never really ghosts. So I think that's a possibility. Like he's just this alien figure that they're not really sure how to make heads or tails of him.
I think that's definitely true. I think I was trying to find a description, one of the early descriptions of him, and sort of the only one I'm able to sort of find off the bat is sort of this one on page, like the middle page 49. His cheeks were pallid and lank, his eyes were sunken, his forehead overshadowed by coarse straggling hairs, his teeth large and irregular, the sound of brilliantly white, and his chin discolored by a tear. So, sort of reading that, you know, it's interesting because it seems that Brown is being really deliberate in making him this outsider figure, just from the get-go. Just the
Yes.
look of him is so distraught and gaunt
And
that,
almost unnatural.
yeah,
Like
oh, absolutely. And
a little inhuman.
yeah, and I think at some point he's referenced as being related to like the supernatural figure, or he's seen like as they're trying to understand him, he sort of takes on this supernatural quality at
Right.
at one point as they're trying to discern, like, you know, who is he, how do we sort of understand him, his goals, his ambitions. So I'm trying to remember what part that was, but I think at one point he sort of figured as that kind of like you said, alien kind of
Mm-hmm.
figure.
Yeah. Yeah, that Carwood is definitely the most the strangest character. The one you can't really pin down, you know, the rest of them, they're kind of framed in a certain way and we understand their goals and motivations and their characters and their personalities, but I feel like he's deliberately like made the outsider, like you said, especially like that description of him, I feel like speaks volumes about what kind of role he's supposed to play.
Absolutely, and something I thought about too, and it's a little unrelated, somewhat, but sort of this idea that like the move from Europe to America, and I know that at the beginning it's sort of talking about the history, and it's sort of happening around the time of American independence, sort of the end of the Revolutionary War. He is
Right.
writing this, well, I guess 10 years after the Revolutionary War. But I'm sort of thinking about it in that way as well. I guess it's more towards the beginning. It doesn't really come up as much as you go on in the book, but sort of that idea that the family is moving from uh, from Europe slowly towards America, and I wondered if there was. I mean, I don't know if Carwin can be read quite like that, but just sort of maybe he embodies this idea of some kind of independence, or, you know, trying to make sense of, you know, who are you as an outsider, someone trying to be somebody different, because Carwin, I think, is trying to make a new life. I know at one point he says he wants to be in Spain and he finds himself in America, but he's sort of this sort of figure that sort of wants to be independent, or wants to be, you know, not this Englishman anymore, wants to be a Spaniard. And that's, I don't know if you can read in quite that way, but that's what I sort of thought about too, is sort of, is he a commentary on, you know, the struggles of trying to be sort of this independent and different figure, you know, as
I
a
feel
sort of
like, yeah, I
outsider.
think that's definitely true. Um, and I don't know. I was also really interested in the introduction, the one stop piece we read at the beginning. He wrote, like, you know, that Gothic literature typically like poses the question of whether or not we're capable of like rational self-governance, or if we're just prone to, you know, religious mania and superstition. Like, are we able to self-govern, or are we just gonna fall into, you know, the typical, you know, Gothic reaction? And I was just thinking about how that question kind of manifests in this novel, because you have characters who seem self-governing, who seem rational, who seem like they have the ideals of the Enlightenment, and then you have characters who are more religious. And I wonder what the commentary is there. Is he siding with one or the other, or is he just showing the dangers of one? Like, I was wondering, but that's been ringing around in my head as I've been reading this.
I sort of think so as well. Something I thought about when you were saying that is sort of this idea that I think one of Washington's last addresses as president was he warned America about getting involved in foreign wars, but you know there isn't as much discussion about, well, what happens now that you're an independent nation? What about, you know, domestic, you know, sort of the fears of domestic affairs now that you're self-governing? You know, what kind of ideologies are you supposed to be dictated by? You know, and I think it's easy maybe to fall into sort of either an overly rational or overly religious kind of discourse. And I wonder if Brown is kind of the foil to Washington in saying, like, you have to be fearful from Washington's perspective of getting involved in international affairs, but at the same time Brown might be saying, well, hold on, well, what about domestic affairs and kind of domestic kinds of terror that we need to be watching out for? And I'm wondering if maybe Brown's trying to say something like that.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of domestic terror makes a lot of sense, because the whole story is happening at their home, on their farm, you know, in the place where they're supposed to feel safest. And I feel like that's a commentary in itself, just the setting, the geographic location, like these monsters, the scary things in this novel, like they're living in the closet, you know, they're living within the house. So I do think that's important and worth noting. And I also feel like, I don't know, maybe he's warning against, you know, extremism of any kind, you know, not falling too far on the spectrum either way, I wonder.
Yeah, and I think so too. I think it was talking about even even when he was sort of growing up, he sort of had this this sort of fear of where um America was going. I think on page 8 of the introduction, he says, our intellectual ore is of no value except as it is capable of being transmuted into gold, and learning and eloquence are desirable only as the means of expeditiously filling our coffers. And you know, I wonder if maybe he's trying to sort of make that commentary, because I think he was very much afraid of where America was sort of heading, sort of where its priorities were. And you know, I'm wondering if he's using religion almost to make a larger argument against, you know, even though it's not directly stated, maybe economic downfall, and sort of a larger sort of adjacent commentary about, you know, like you said, going too far extreme in any direction, be it economics, be it intellectual discourse.
Right.
And yeah, I'm wondering if maybe that's part of it as well.
Yeah, and I think he's definitely against the type of religiousness, like Puritan type, you know, hellfire and damnation kind of religiosity. At the bottom of the page, you were just saying, you know, in the early decades of the 19th century, authors of novels frequently found themselves the recipients of puritanical fury. Yeah, and authors turn to writing fiction as a means of reaching a wider public with their moral allegories. So I definitely feel like he's like anti-religious extremism, because right off the bat, we see what happens to the father. He spontaneously combusts, apparently. And I feel like, there's a fate for people who fall too far into that trap.
Yeah, I thought that was kind of really interesting too, because I don't know if I can find the exact page, but I know that yeah, I guess on page 12, when he deigned to be communicative in the middle of page 12, he hinted that his peace of mind was flown in consequence of deviation from his duty, like how important his religiosity was.
Mm-hmm.
And sort of in his mind, that his death that he thinks is coming is consequence of him not being religious enough, of not being extreme enough
Right.
in his views. And I think Brown is trying to be somewhat satiric there, just trying to make sort of a sort of poke fun at
Yeah,
the
it's
idea
almost
that
kind of comical that he just like blows up, like there's no real cause of death, or at least not yet, because I haven't finished the novel, but just the way that's introduced right off the bat.
I mean they the kids go sort of back and forth. I think Clara at several points, and I think Wyland sort of make reference to where the father was killed. And I think it's interesting, something I hadn't thought about till just now, was how they turn that temple into sort of this intellectual salon. And it's sort of like they're stripping away its religious context and sort of making it this sort of intellectual house of worship in some ways.
That's
And that
true.
this Yeah, and they're sort of swinging the pendulum the other way in some ways, and going from religion to intellectualism is sort
Right.
of this
And I,
um
I feel like both of those are just like religion and intellectualism are just both so present within the novel, that they're kind of, I guess they're battling with each other. They're at odds with one another. But you can't deny that there's both. I mean, you definitely can see the influence of, like the Enlightenment and the rationalism at the time.
no, I think it's really interesting for me, sort of thinking back to the paper that I had written, sort of this idea that reason was sort of so tied to the senses, that
Mm-hmm.
how we hear things, how we see things, sort of become truth. And like I said before, I know you haven't gotten quite to that part, but sort of you'll see it when you get, I think, chapter 12, 13, 14, sort of how Plyle becomes so enamored with what he hears that it becomes the be all and end all of his beliefs,
Yeah,
and
in
sort of how
that
he tries
sense,
to
like his
argue them.
senses are steering him in the wrong direction, and they don't lead to truth, which is, you know, goes against that rationalist idea. Yeah, very interesting. I feel like there's so much to look at here, and we're not even like about halfway.
No, yeah. I mean, reading that introduction and trying to make sense of all the sort of different arguments that he's trying to make with different characters. I think it's I'm still trying to figure it out a little bit. I think it is kind of difficult, because if he's not making an argument so much as just stating things, I
Mm-hmm.
think it becomes more difficult to come down on one side or the other in terms of what he's trying to say. And I think that makes it more enigmatic, and trying to suss out,
Yeah,
what
for
should
sure.
the takeaway be? What should the alternative be? If he doesn't provide me one, what should I make the alternative be, in terms of
Right.
understanding the novel? And that's something I try to think about as I'm reading, is like, oh, what should the takeaway? What should the message be as I'm going through?
Yeah, and I'm interested to hear what everybody else has to say about it, to read others' discussions, because
Oh
you know
yeah,
um,
absolutely,
there's
absolutely.
just, like I said, so much, and I feel like I I pretty much got through everything I wanted to talk about. Is there anything else you wanted to bring up?
I not necessarily. Most of my trying to read the book was really just trying to understand how different people sort of get caught up in their beliefs and trying to follow their strains of their thinking and their logic in terms of how do we come to know what we know, or like how do we what's the basis for knowledge or understanding,
Right.
which I imagine is part of the argument here is maybe Brown because he wants to write a novel that's thoughtful and sort of makes you think, and so that's what I'm trying to understand is how Brown understands understanding and thinking of how we
Yeah.
come to know the world.
And I think that's really helpful to keep in mind as you're reading. You know, I always feel like I have a few questions that are just floating around in my brain as I read the novel just to think about. And I think that is helpful, and I think it's very central. But yeah, I feel like we touched upon a lot, and I feel
It was definitely
like I have a little more clarity. So
I think I do too. I think I have a little more clarity as well.
yeah, sweet. So are we good? It's 1:36.
Yeah. I think we definitely got our 30 minutes in because the Zoom meeting wasn't supposed to be more than 30 minutes because the cap was like 45. So I think we're definitely well within that.
Okay, perfect. Well, it was good talking to you.
Yeah, good talking to you too.
I'll see you in other classes
Yeah,
virtually.
definitely.
All right, bye.
Bye.